So our next panelist, I've been in situations where I've been in meetings and sometimes somebody will say, let's ask Sylvia what she thinks, and then I realize that it's not me. But it's Sylvia with the Y, and obviously somebody with who's been a highly respected and thoughtful policy analyst. She's regularly called upon to provide perspectives on the implications of the nation's changing demographics at conferences and meetings. She often serves as a keynote speaker. She's a media expert on Latino issues and has published numerous reports that articulate the vital role that Latinos play in society. She received her master's from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. She served as the executive director of the Latino Policy Forum, among many wonderful and illustrious activities that she's been a part of. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia.
Well, let me extend my congratulations to Luis for not only for his vision, but his tenacity of keeping Latinos Progresando alive and strong and growing for 15 years. And what a distinguished panel to sit and follow and be part of. So just really my esteemed regards and respect for all of my other colleagues who are speaking today. I actually have been asked to talk about education. And so that's what I'm going to do a little bit about. And I'm going to share a story that I have never really shared publicly before, but when I walked in, Jose Luis says to me, Sylvia, Mexican, what is that? And I said, I'm talking about education. Mexican is cultural. Education and all of our issues are political, right? And not everybody agrees with me when I think that and when I say that. But as Marty was talking and sharing his story, and then we heard the history that was shared by Virginia and Chewy, what I realized, and the story that I've never told before, is that when I was a junior in high school, I transferred from Proviso East, which is in Maywood, Illinois, where I had been the number 5 ranked student. I'm not saying this to brag, but I had been the number 5 ranked student among 1,000 students. And many of you may know that Maywood is a fairly working class, lower socioeconomic community. And my whole worldview changed when I walked into Oak Park River Forest High School, and there were no metal detectors to go through, and students were sitting around and lounging, and it was an open campus. And when I went to go register for school, and I didn't know this story remember this story until my mother told me just earlier this year, they said they were going to put me in remedial classes. And I said, what? I was in honors classes. What do you mean you're going to put me in remedial classes? You're not going to do that without testing me first. Now, how did I know to say and do that as a 14, 15-year-old sophomore, soon-to-be junior high school student? It is because growing up in the suburbs, the way that I grew up in the suburbs, the refrain of my childhood was, where do you come from? And when I said, well, I was born in Chicago, they would say, well, where do you really come from? Well, my parents are from Texas, and like Marty's family, my grandfather was murdered as a law enforcement official 100 years ago today. They said, Texas, you can't be from Texas. And the reason I think that I knew to ask that question and make that demand that they weren't going to put me in remedial courses is because I read and I read and I read, and I went to the library and I found every single book I could find on Mexican history and the Chicano. And that taught me who I was. And when we look at why and how these things are not being taught in our education system today, it is no wonder that so many of our students are lost and floundering and don't have their sense of roots and dignity and pride and the foundation that I knew to stand on. And I knew that because my parents, without knowing that they were being activists, were being activists. So it's so ironic what I want to share with you today about what I think the greatest challenge is for the Latino and the Mexican community today. That my father told me the story that in the 1960s, he got a group of parents together and they did battle with the local school district to hire a bilingual early childhood education teacher in preschool so the kids could have that head start in learning English. It is no wonder that they learned their foundation in starting one of the very first Latino organizations in the suburbs. I have no idea where that came from or how they did that, but I had those role models without even knowing that they were role models for me at the time. And so when we look at what do our Latino Mexican children need to be successful in school, it is that sense of history, and it is also those role models that they can look up to. And that's something that we can all contribute to in their education, regardless of whether we're educators or not. But when we look at the question of what do we do around the public resource investment in education, what I wanted to share with you today is that I was talking to some of the folks that I know, and some of the people in my office, and we agreed that we were all sort of nerdy in grade school and high school because we read and we read and we read. I spent my summers at the library, and when I talked to some of my friends who are my age and older, who went to college in the 70s and were the first of their generation, they said the same thing to me. They were geeks. They read and they read and they read. And I recently heard Justice Sotomayor say the same thing, that when she was a small child, she read and she read. And some of her books were my favorite books, the Nancy Drew Detective Series. She was bright, curious, inquisitive, always asking questions. And when she shared that, I thought, maybe those books influenced me in more ways than I can consciously say. But the importance of early literacy can't be emphasized enough. One of the most important benchmarks to educational success is if a student is reading by third grade, in third grade, right? Researchers can now predict with a fair amount of accuracy that if that student is not reading at a third grade level in third grade, they are likely not to finish high school. That's not a good thing. It's not a good thing because we know that the dropout needle has only moved very slightly to now being about 45%. And when we know that only 45% of our third graders are not reading in third grade, we're not going to see that needle move much over the next decade to come. So as we consider school reform efforts and efforts to improve the quality of schools, it takes time. Because research says for that needle to move, it's going to take about 8 years of quality leadership, collective vision, sufficient time for teacher planning and preparation, and community and family engagement. So as we look to our future and we look to our history, we are, a generation these days on these devices is a year or less. And we're talking about school change taking 8 years. We're not going to see dramatic improvement in those high school completion rates for at least the next decade, no matter how hard we work now to facilitate that change. Yet we must work now to facilitate that change for the hope and the future of our community and our children. So what I believe public funds and schools need to do is to invest in basic literacy. That basic literacy, both formally and informally, tutoring and mentoring programs that can be formal and can be funded by community organizations, school family reading nights, any of you and all of us that can read to a very young child, to provide parenting education on the importance of literacy, which the Latino Policy Forum does through its Abriendo Puertas program. That basic literacy. But our public resources and our public accountability
also must ensure that we have high-quality teachers in every single classroom. Because when we talk about public funds, I get so fed up about the question of whether or not money makes a difference. And we shouldn't be investing more money in education, because is it going to go to waste? And is it going to really matter? What I want to say to you is that 80% of the education resources that we spend go on teachers and go to pay teachers' salaries. And guess what? High-quality teachers get paid more. And those high-quality teachers are disproportionately in high-wealth, low-poverty school districts. They pay them more, they cost more, they have bigger budgets. And those average teachers, or the less than average teachers, are disproportionately in low-wealth school districts. And guess what? Those low-wealth school districts are disproportionately districts where most of our Latino and African American children attend. So those high-quality teachers cost more, and they have higher salaries. So one of the biggest things I think that we can do in our investment of public dollars to advance our children's education is to create incentives so that those low-wealth school districts can afford to hire more high-quality teachers. Because the research tells us that 3 years of a high-quality teacher, you can almost eliminate the education achievement gap that is so pervasive right now. We also need to provide more of our children with access to early childhood education. Latino children, despite being the growing demographic, have the least amount of access to early childhood education. So the first thing we need to do with those public funds is to build more early childhood education facilities in our Latino communities. We don't go because there's not enough access, there's not enough space, there are not enough centers in our community. But we also need to build on the strengths of Latino children, because research tells us that children come to school, and our Latino children, and in particular our Mexican children, come to preschool with strong social skills, which are part of their cultural foundation. There is this recent study that says, we know this, we grow up in warm, supportive households where there's a lot of cariño. Our children are taught respect for their elders. So our children, despite poverty, despite increasing poverty in our Mexican and Latino community, come to school with the soft skills which are well intact. But unfortunately, too many are coming in already in preschool, if they get in preschool, 6 months behind academically. Over their lifetime, research tells us, they are likely to know 30 million fewer words. They don't know their colors, they don't know their alphabet, and so much of this educational outcome is dependent on their access to preschool, but also the other important variable is their mother's education level. And unfortunately, 40% of our mothers have less than a high school education. So my daughter had a friend since kindergarten who I thought this young girl was brilliant. She was analytical, had a strong personality, was at a young age committed to social justice. She was such a contrast to my daughter, who is an artist, but they were best friends. Sometimes I thought I got the wrong daughter, but my daughter taught me a lot, because my daughter really was this artistic, creative, non-linear thinker. And what she would say to me is that she would have a conversation with my daughter in 3rd and 4th grade and then in high school, and she would have to go home and look up the words that my daughter Veronica said in the dictionary, because she didn't know them. Despite her brilliance, growing up in a household where Spanish was spoken, where her parents didn't have that strong educational foundation, she was still at this disadvantage that the research plays out and that our children at that very young age come into school knowing many, many fewer words and vocabulary, and that exists and never goes away over their lifetime. So ensuring that strong foundation of quality early childhood education means that there's a teacher that can speak to them in a language that they can understand, and that we must invest more in teacher preparation so that there are more teachers who are bilingual and who are culturally competent to ground our children in their native language so that they have that strong foundation, which the research tells us is the jumping point to learning a second language. So what can be done to improve the educational outcomes of the Mexican community? To sum it up, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be complex and it's going to take a long time. That we must invest in early learning. We must make sure that we are reading to our children and teaching our parents that one of the most important things they can do is read to their children every single day. And we must make sure that we use our public funds to train teachers to work with children who are learning English, to train teachers to be bilingual and culturally competent, to have high-quality teachers in all of our children's classrooms, to make sure that more of our children have access to early learning opportunities, and to make sure that all of our children have quality early learning opportunities. This we must do for the sake of our children, and for our future as a Latino community, but also for our shared future for this city, this state, and this nation.
You can tell that Sylvia is a media expert because she answered all of the follow-up questions that I was going to ask. So thank you. I guess one follow-up question is, do you feel optimistic about where we will be 8 years from now? Do you think that we're doing enough now?
I feel optimistic for two reasons. Number one, if I didn't, I couldn't have the job that I have. I couldn't be doing what I do every day and getting up for work. So yes, I think that change is slow and change is incremental and it's not happening at a fast enough pace. But I feel optimistic for two ones. Number one is because our population is growing. And the recent data tells us that we've seen a 30% gain over the past decade in the number of Latinos who have graduated from college. But what that translates to, because of our demographic growth, it translates into double the amount of college graduates in the state of Illinois. So there are twice as many people who have completed college. And I think with that arc of improved educational outcomes and more of us having that, with the commitment to give back to the community, and if everybody were to make that commitment of doing something as basic as reading to children, I think it can, and that it will make a difference. The other reason that I'm optimistic is because as we have grown and become more politically sophisticated, as we have worked to improve and enhance our civil rights, there are now, certainly not enough, but more of us sitting at the table to have those conversations in the school reform movement about how we should be improving education for all of our children. And I'm just going to give you one little story. Gary knows as well. The Illinois State Board of Education and the P20 Council is considering what should be the standards that all teachers need to have to be a teacher in the state of Illinois. This hasn't happened yet, but we are now sitting at the table saying that one of the things that every single teacher that graduates from any school of education in the state needs to have is basic training in second language learning. Not just bilingual teachers, but because of our growth, because of our disbursement throughout the whole state, all teachers need to have that. Now that hasn't happened yet, but we're asking the question, we're sitting at the table, we're going to stay present at the table until we can reform our teacher standards to make sure at least that one little thing happens.